Did you know that the United States is #1 in the world for diabetes, and not in a good way? Now I want to clarify that we are talking about type 2 diabetes today, although we will discuss the differences between type 1 and type 2, some symptoms to be aware of, and ways that we can prevent and even reverse it. Think about this. In 1976, type 2 diabetes was rare. Only 5% of people over the age of 65 in America had it. And today, we have 128 million Americans who are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. And y'all, 30% of our kids are pre-diabetic, and most of them don't even know it. What used to be called adult onset diabetes, we can no longer call it that because of how many kids are now diagnosed with it. This has to change. I had a family member who once said, "If I get diabetes, no big deal. I'll just take the medicine for it." You can imagine my reaction. But the truth is, this person just didn't understand the systemic nature and the detrimental impacts diabetes can have. And today, I want to shed some light on these. A few downstream effects of diabetes are slow or non-healing wounds, neuropathy, which is decreased sensation or numbness, typically in the hands and feet, blindness, amputation, and some people even end up on dialysis. Diabetes is very hard on the small vessels of the kidneys. And in fact, diabetes is the #1 cause of chronic kidney disease. Diabetes is also highly correlated with hypertension or high blood pressure, and that's why there's a significantly increased risk of heart disease and stroke. And I must mention that some ethnicities have a higher predisposition for type 2 diabetes. Hispanic, Native American, East Asian, Asian American, and African American populations. Now, in over 22 years as a practicing adult and geriatric physical therapist, I've seen thousands of patients with type 2 diabetes, and I've seen a lot of problems from that. But the story of Carolyn is one that is burned into my brain forever. You see, I met Carolyn in the ICU of a large hospital I was working in at the time. Carolyn was sweet and soft-spoken, probably around 60-year-old woman. She had type 2 diabetes, was morbidly obese, and had several other chronic conditions. Carolyn had nicked her inner thigh shaving. I still do this all the time, but her little nick did not heal. And she ended up having necrotizing fasciitis, also known as flesh-eating bacteria. Yes, this is rare, and it is no joke, y'all. No joke. Before long, this wicked bacteria had eroded her entire upper thigh and genital area. Now, many people don't know that some physical therapists actually perform wound care. And so I was working in conjunction with her infectious disease doc and her plastic surgeon trying to heal this now enormous open wound. To make matters worse, she had been mostly bedbound for several weeks and developed a massive pressure ulcer or bed sore on her rear end. Y'all, this poor woman, it would sometimes take us 2 hours to perform the wound care and complete the wound care necessary to this large and very delicate surface area. It was painful. We had to have her pre-medicated with very strong opioids, and it was just tedious, and she endured like a champ. We were also working on her mobility and trying to get her stronger. And after 2 to 3 months in the hospital, Carolyn was finally able to leave. Thank goodness. But her daughter had to sell her house and find an assisted living facility to move her into because she could never live on her own again. So what began as just a little shaving nick ended up changing Carolyn's life forever. So what is diabetes? When we eat carbohydrates, they break down into sugars, and our pancreas secretes insulin in response to that. The insulin is the key to allowing the glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cell. In a type 1 diabetic, the problem is that the pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreas, do not produce insulin. And this is why you may see a type 1 diabetic injecting themselves with exogenous insulin. You've probably also heard of gestational diabetes. This is when a pregnant woman who was not diabetic before becomes diabetic during pregnancy. Now, this can increase the likelihood of the mother and the baby having type 2 diabetes down the road. It can also lead to some other problems, and this is why it should be monitored very closely. Now, in type 2 diabetes, there isn't a problem with the insulin being secreted. The problem lies in the amount of insulin surging out in response to lots of incoming blood sugar. Eventually, the insulin receptors on those cells get dulled to the signal, and they just ignore it, and they won't let the blood sugar in anymore. Over time, high blood sugar levels begin to damage the nerves, the eyes, kidneys, heart, as we discussed. And I want to mention that type 2 diabetes quadruples your risk for Alzheimer's disease, and it is now being called type 3 diabetes of the brain. And Alzheimer's disease is expected to triple by the year 2050. So preventing or reversing type 2 diabetes is important on so many levels. So what are some common signs and symptoms of diabetes that you need to look for in yourself and or a loved one? Frequent urination, excessive thirst, excessive hunger, blurred vision, fatigue, and also dark spots on the back of the neck or armpit, which we call acanthosis nigricans. That's just a big word. But look for those things. If you see those things, please go get checked out. And how do you know if you have type 2 diabetes or if you're pre-diabetic? Your physician or provider is going to diagnose this based on blood work. So they can either do a fasting glucose test. Typically, we want this under 100 milligrams per deciliter. Ideally, we want it 85 or less, but under 100 is still considered in normal range. Most providers and physicians are going to say you're pre-diabetic if you're anywhere from 100 to 125 milligrams per deciliter. If you are over 125, that is when they will officially say you are diabetic. Another test some providers prefer is the A1C, which is a 3-month average of your blood glucose. With your A1C, we want it less than 5.6. 5.7 to 6.4 is generally considered pre-diabetic. And then 6.5 or higher is considered diabetic with your A1C value. If you have access to a glucometer, that's a little device that requires the finger prick method. You could check your own blood sugar and see what it is. Just be wise to note if you were fasting or if you'd already have something to eat or drink that day. Another thing that's becoming very popular are the CGMs, the continuous glucose monitors. So there are many non-diabetics who actually love having these because they're wanting to see what kind of foods may spike their blood sugar, and then they can also see how quickly it comes back down. So the CGM is a little device that's typically applied on the back of the upper arm, and it doesn't penetrate into the blood. It's actually little filaments that penetrate into the interstitial fluid to assimilate a blood glucose reading from there. Most are attached to like an app, and so you can see your blood sugar in this continuous way all the time. And so that's very important data to kind of see trends based on your habits, right? So you will see those, if you haven't already, becoming much more popular. All right, I keep saying we can prevent and reverse type 2 diabetes. How do we do that, y'all? Number one, walk after meals. If you cannot walk because of time constraints or weather or whatever the case may be, which is often the case at our house. We have 3 teenagers. Things are crazy. We can't always just go for a walk after a meal. Do 10 to 20 air squats. You can do that. If you have stairs in your home or apartment complex, go up the stairs a couple times. All right, just move. Number 2, strength train. Again, we've got to lift those weights for so many reasons, but 80% of our glucose uptake happens in the skeletal muscle. And when it's contracted, it lets the glucose right in without the need for insulin. So resistance training and putting on more muscle is mission critical to your metabolic health and your glucose disposal. And number 3, as the brilliant Dr. Robert Lustig says, most chronic diseases are foodable, not druggable, and can be prevented, minimized, or reversed by a change in diet. So significantly reduce or eliminate your liquid sugar intake. That's juices, fancy coffees, sodas, even diet sodas, and dare I say, alcohol. We want to really examine and reduce our ultra-processed foods. They're so easy, they're so convenient. I get it, we're all on the go. Just try and minimize as best you can the ultra-processed foods because they're really a huge driver to all of these chronic diseases. We also want to really zoom in on the amount of carbs we're eating and the quality of carbs that we're eating. So I have to mention, there was a Virta Health study that showed people with type 2 diabetes on a ketogenic diet without caloric restriction for 2 years, 80% of them reversed their diabetes. Okay? That is huge. This is by no means a prescription for you, but it is a glaring example of root cause, and I believe worth discussing with your physician or provider. I've never been a fan of diets because I believe strongly in more sustainable, long-term habits, but I can promise you this: if myself or a loved one of mine were diagnosed with pre-diabetes or diabetes or mild cognitive impairment or early stage dementia, I would strongly encourage them to get on a ketogenic diet because of all the positive research that is coming out in terms of outcomes for really turning these debilitating diseases in the right direction. If you'd like to take a deeper dive, 2 very valuable resources are Dr. Lustig's book, Metabolical, and also a book by Dr. Casey Means called Good Energy. We will link those in our show notes, along with a glucose disposal agent that many folks are finding very effective at lowering their glucose and increasing their insulin sensitivity. Thank you for joining me today. And if you found healthful connections here, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend or loved one.